I'm going to be attempting to marry some of what Dent shared with us already so skillfully and lovingly, and think in the great both and that we're invited to consider that's so inherent to our Anglican and Episcopal ethos. So we're going to be talking about our creative juices and how those things invite us into these innovative spaces that Dent had shared, and also how we recognize that we are in some ways bound to tradition in ways that can challenge that stuff for us. It's so hard for us to really find our sound when we consider the fact that we share worship with people who really don't have the same understanding of aesthetics as we do. Different folks have different songs in their hearts, just like different folks have different ideas in their heads. And so it's important for us to do a little bit of not only learning, but unlearning when we attempt to be together. I'm reminded of the great Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who in his little book, Life Together, playfully said to us that anytime you join a Christian community, get rid of your wish dream. Whatever you were hoping it's going to be like, it's not really going to be like that anymore. So before I get started, what I'd like to do is kind of take you back in my own experiential sense of time through a song. And I am a rector of a church now. Some people, would call me by the title Reverend Doctor, but 10 years ago, I was a guy sitting in a bar playing songs for people. And the editor of our 1982 hymnal, Ray Glover, I had the blessing of getting to be with him right before the end of his earthly journey. And in some of those conversations as he was nearing the end of his life, he and I really talked a lot about music and evangelism. And he said to me very transparently, once he had gotten to know me, "Well, Rick, when I'm in church, I don't want to feel like I'm in a bar." And to that, I had to just quietly disagree, because being in a bar brought me into the church. And there's a time when it sounded something like this. And if you know this, I encourage you to sing along. Mama, take this badge from me, so I can use it anymore. It's getting dark, too dark to see. Feel like I'm knocking on heaven's door. Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door. Knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door. Mama put my guns in the ground, so I can shoot them anymore. So 10 years ago, I was sitting in a bar playing in a band with my father. I loved when Jerusalem shared earlier about having a hippie Christian upbringing, because that's very much what my early life was like. I had a dad who played bass and sang in a kind of Neil Young, Crosby, Stills, Nash type group, a mother who recorded Joni Mitchell covers, and all of the baggage that came with that sort of upbringing. And that my parents were part of a culture that invited some things that maybe weren't so healthy in that loving Christian hippie zeitgeist. Now, in my formative years, I was raised in urban Miami in a non-denominational, almost exclusively Haitian congregation, where I was baptized in a wool swimming suit, full submersion, at 7 years old. And so, 10 years ago, when I was sitting in the bar and playing songs with my dad, and a very storied Episcopal rector had heard about our duo, he called me on the phone and said, "Rick, I'm looking for someone to help bridge the contemporary sound in our church that was a very coastal, tourist, young congregation with the traditional Episcopal ethos that a certain cadre of the congregation was very, very comfortable with." Now, I wouldn't have guessed it, but I would end up some years later, not too many years later, ordained in the Episcopal tradition myself as a priest. I would go on after seminary to do doctoral work down at Duke, and I would be welcome to have a congregation of my own where I serve the best that I can, a wonderful group of people in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Now, if any of you have ideas about what Lancaster, Pennsylvania might be right, you're probably correct. My wife and I, when we drove up to Pennsylvania with our two little boys to see horses and buggies on the roads, didn't even know what to make of what we were seeing coming from where we had come from. And so I found myself in a context that was vastly different from the one in which I was raised, and even different from the Episcopal ethos that I had entered the church as a member of. Coming into a church as a contemporary musician, steering services aimed at youth and trying to evangelize is a beautiful thing and a wonderful opportunity for us to open our throats, if you will, to the great tapestry of folks yearning for a story, yearning for connection, yearning for community. And at the same time, as most of us probably recognize who are tradition in the church, we come up against obstacles that not only dissuade us from innovation, but that can prevent us from feeling comfortable even trying. Folks will get up and walk out of the room when we try to suggest that we want them to do something new. And so with that in mind, it's my hope that we can spend some of this time together on the back end of this story, thinking together about ways that we can use our creativity and our drive to innovate and evangelize in a way that doesn't alienate folks who find not only value, but a sense of home and community and the familiar that sometimes risks feeling taken away when we do try new things. One of the amazing propensities that we share as human beings, creatures who have evolved over time, whose brains have complexified, is we have this reptilian, almost amygdala sense of sensibilities that before we're even aware of what we think can prompt us to want to fight, to flee, or to freeze. And we have things called heuristics at work in our brains, cognitive shortcuts that help us to process massive amounts of information very quickly without having to think about it. And because of that, we have a much stronger reaction to the potential of losing a thing than we do to the benefit of gaining something of equal or even greater value. We call this loss aversion, and it's a real thing. So part of what I find so fascinating is when we're blessed to gather in a group like this, who are coming to share new ideas and who have great passion for ministry, it occurs to me that in the both and of our identity, we've got to be really, really mindful of how we are in dialogue openly with folks who are genuinely afraid of what they stand to lose by any kind of change. And so what I provided for those of you who are here with us in the room and on Zoom is a little 8-page handout that I'd like to explain something about. Because you'll notice most of the time we have presentations these days, they're nice PowerPoints with cool font, and this is actually my handwriting. And as a Lenten discipline during the COVID crisis, I decided I had recently finished my doctorate, and I had 50 or 60 books that had just been in piles around me that I had been using for my research. And I decided that I wanted to take all of the tastiest bits of important stuff from these stacks of my favorite books and whittle them down into a 150-page journal that I could just take around the world with me and remind myself of important takeaways from different authors or tracts of spiritual wisdom that really resonated with me. And so what we have today are 8 pages from that journal that I think tells a story about our quest for finding our sound through some very savvy and cogent leadership principles that I think ground us in our faith and also offer us up some sound strategies for how we approach the work of innovation. And so as we begin, I think it's important for us to remember that one of the things that does separate us from the work of a good Rotary Club is that we're finding our footing in this good news story. We're locating everything that we do in God's narrative and the way that we interpret and approach that for our lives. When it comes to the stuff of innovation and the adventure of trying to change, to engage metanoia and transformation in line with the gospel, it's helpful for us to begin with that balance of knowing that we do not know, even as we go boldly toward the future. And so I begin, like many of our friends in 12-step programs, with the beautiful serenity prayer of Reinhold Niebuhr. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and of course the wisdom to know the difference. And it's amazing how universally applicable this is to the spiritual life, to the quest of a transformed life, a joy-filled life, because we're always engaged in those prayers that we strive for without ceasing to find the balance between our courage and our acceptance. And so in the both and, the confluence of those things, I think that we flip the page and we do what we can to faithfully enter what the Hebrews call Hamidbar, the great wilderness. There's a fantastic book by Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, who offers up a really, really easy entry into the wisdom of Kabbalah. And in this book, Honey from the Rock is he speaks about a wilderness of preparation, which any journey of change really is. He invites us to think about the fact that each of us, as Jerusalem had said this morning, have gifts and charisms in our way that we're not even aware we possess. In fact, as Lawrence Kushner puts it, we can have talents and skills for our journey that seem so useless to us that they are like pieces of a puzzle that we don't even own. But as Kushner says, everyone carries with them at least one and probably many pieces to someone else's puzzle. Sometimes they don't know it. And when you present your piece, which is worthless to you, to another, whether you know it or not, whether they know it or not, you are a messenger from the Most High. And I think that this is part of the sense of finding our courage and trusting that we can have insights and perspectives that are the very thing that someone needs to open their heart and their mind to exploration, to the metaphorical journey into the wilderness. Because as Kushner teaches, and as I think we all find to some extent, the wilderness is a way of being. And it demands being open to the flow of life around us. And entrances to the holy are everywhere. And when we think about music, this is one of, I think, the approaches that we can take with our friends who see things differently than we do, to have courage to explore the unfamiliar in the possibility that something new could be an entrance to the holy. And so one of the difficulties that we find that I loved, our brother Dent invited us to think about this from a different perspective, is you brought us back to the beginning of that Exodus narrative, right? And Moses hearing something from that bush which burned but wasn't consumed. And of course, Moses is saying, I'm not the guy for this gig, But even when he's able to witness to God's people in bondage and lead them with God's help out of slavery into the wilderness, how do the people react? Is it positive? Is it happy? Now, there's quite a bit of griping, right? To the point where they say, let's go back to Egypt, where at least we were by the flesh pots. We knew what we were going to get. Now we're out here in the middle of nowhere. We're going to starve. Change can feel like starvation for traditioned people. So for as wonderful and energetic as we can be about mission and evangelism and innovation, how might that feel to that lonely person who feels we might be trying to take from them the only thing that's familiar? The way that worship looks and feels, the way that worship sounds, right? The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt. We had our fill of bread. But you brought us out here into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. But I think there's another step to this. And this isn't just because of COVID. It isn't just because of current political dynamics. But as a church, we are in a new kind of wilderness that is forcing us, even in the midst of our love for the traditional, to think in completely new ways because we live in a different culture. And a few of the forces that we see shaping our world are things that we tend to every single day. It affects not only what we think and feel, but the sounds that we hear in the voices of others, the rhythms of our life as they speed up, the harsh tones that come through, even in a lot of modern music. Globalization, in so many ways, expands the world. And we think of the fact that it's incredible that we can be together on Zoom, that we can FaceTime with family when we're far apart, that we've been able to stay connected because of technology during this pandemic. But there are consequences to that. And then we also think about the ways in which, in many ways, the Homo sapien has become the Homo economicus. We live in a highly financialized world. And this means that all around us, we see growing asymmetries in wealth. We see disruptions in the trends and the models that are shaping us. We see age distinctions where that wealth means that folks like myself are having fewer children. The workforce is going to shrink in the future, as it has already, continuously and more so, because of artificial intelligence. And of course, we know and we felt polarization through intense and scary rhetoric. Our trust has been overwhelmed by distrust, pervading cynicism. And this is something that I think we find particularly true when we try to come up with solutions, is that in the cynicism of the world, even when you walk on water, they'll say it's because you don't know how to swim. And so how is it that we find heart and maintain heart in the midst of these sorts of things? How is it that as music ministers, we consider the context of the entire zeitgeist of our society and remain sensitive to the needs of those who are highly traditional in our congregations, while still recognizing that we can't go back to Egypt? The world is different. And if we're going to thrive, let alone survive as a church, we need to try on some good new habits. So when we look at the next page here, if you can flip that, traditioned innovation is an opportunity, I think, for us not only to approach the work of being competent leaders in the church from an administrative point of view, but also ways to be strategic about our approaches to liturgy and music. We've got to take time to consider purpose. Now, oftentimes we're going to get that feedback that, well, we can't do this because of that, right? We can't change our worship music because it will really get our organist mad. And our organist is really here as a favor. We're not paying her that well as it is. And you don't want to ruffle that feather, believe me. We might not want to change what we're doing sonically because we're afraid that those people who are paying our bills, those few stewards that frankly hold the purse strings of our church, are going to be resistant to that change. But even as we approach it, as leaders, we're invited to think about how we shift our thinking from we can't because to we can if. And this is the work of bridge building, of finding something of that via media that is so intrinsic to our Anglican Episcopal DNA. And if we live into those tensions, I think this is where we put real skin on catchphrases that we use about both and versus either or. What I loved about Dent's presentation was how you showed us ways that we can use music that is already in our DNA and find practical ways to enliven it in ways that could be invitational and evangelizing without alienating folks who feel like we've walked away from their vernacular, from what is familiar. And so that is a perfectly good instance of how we bridge the both and without making folks feel like we've completely disregarded what has been built. This is not the act of uprooting what has been planted, but the invitation to prune in such a way that new growth is possible. Because one of the things that I found personally, and this is going to be different for each of us in each of our contexts, is that my journey from a contemporary musician in a set where I was taking requests on the fly and entertaining folks to fill a tip jar, to being the rector of a church that is quite conservative in its hymnody, is that no matter what our ideas might be, no matter how driven we might be to try every new thing, we only lead well, we only participate well in community when we keep change within the adaptive capacity of our folks. And that's going to be different in every one of our contexts. There are certain things that we could try here at St. Mary's that probably wouldn't work at St. Edward's in Lancaster. There are things that worked at St. Mark's in Fort Lauderdale, where I was, that didn't work at St. James in Lancaster, where I was. And for as many churches as we all tend to navigate in a mobile world where we visit different places on different Sunday mornings, where by virtue of our moving and taking new jobs throughout our lives, we come into contact with a lot of different communities. And we recognize that no two are exactly alike. And so remaining sensitive to those nuances is really at the heart, I think, of loving our way into music ministry. So one of the things that I learned when I was studying down at Duke that I think is really, really helpful, and I understand that Lorenzo's working with this as well today, is an approach to design thinking. And this would be on the next page, my friend. Forging strategies that can work. Now, this is straight out of the Harvard Business School model, and we have the great Roger Martin to thank for this approach to design thinking. But it really is a wonderful cascading way of considering how we go about determining and implementing what it is that we do in our businesses and most certainly in our churches. And I'd like for us to walk through this together, thinking about music ministry. Goals. We want to start with a sense of what is it that we want to accomplish in the church. We got to prune, we got to decide what is our deepest aspiration and why is that? So any wonderings here, what might be our deepest aspiration as folks who would come to an evangelism conference and sit in a module on music ministry? Let's hear something from the group gathered here. What might be our deepest aspiration and why? Holly.
Geez. So for me, and you're going to hear it later, it's the idea that music is a gateway to the soul. And a key part of evangelism is helping people to use music to find their faith.
Okay. Any other insights around that? What are our deepest aspirations around music and why? Dent.
Just the simple, not easy concept of opening hearts, lowering defenses. We are, I will speak for myself. I grew up in a fairly conservative tradition of music for many, many years. And it was somebody very close to me that slapped me upside the head and helped me realize that there's a lot more to it. But my heart had become hardened because I was taught one way. So opening hearts is really important to me. and one of my chief goals.
Thank you. Now, Dent and Holly, part of what I hear in that is it sounds that it sounds to me like there's a shared sense here, particularly with we church musician types, to find not only the spiritual connection of our religious and institutional affiliation, but this sense of our experience of love and of God-inspired passion that comes through with music, and then the real desire to share that with people so that others can have something of that sense of being opened in our heart space. I love that language around finding hardness in our hearts, calcification, right? And then how music can oftentimes be a gateway to the softening of that spirit, right? And if that can happen to us, that can really be that sense of, my goodness, I want to share this gateway to good news with other people. Now, one of the things that I also hear in that is the way in which we are seldom invited to growth when we're feeling particularly strong and set in our ways, right? Vulnerability, the model of Christ's own vulnerability, right? The kenosis of God taking on human form, lowering God's self to live and die as one of us, to walk among us, gives us that model of how we can also be open and vulnerable and grow. How through being called to our own transformation, we model that ability to be transformed for other persons, right? So oftentimes, these abilities to make changes really start with us, by our own sense of flexibility as music ministers. Now, that's not going to be the same for all of us, because some of us who are members of the Organ Guild might have a very different reaction to trying one sort of thing than somebody that played in a bar for 20 years has to trying this sort of a thing. So this also works within that confluence of the both and, is that musically, just like we don't want to politically make assumptions that fail to welcome one person or another person, optimally, we would be crafting an approach to music that would be like that as well. But here's one of the strange ironies, and tell me if this resonates. Oftentimes, we artistic types are so passionately involved with the sounds that give meaning to our lives that we are inherently defensive of them. And so just like we are all hardwired to have these negativity biases, these aversions of loss in our heuristics, those shortcuts that we take in our brain, we're just as guilty. Even when we claim to be open-minded, we're open-minded about open-mindedness. We're probably closed-minded about tradition when we're of that heart set and that mindset. So holding ourselves accountable in that great flow is also really important. So setting our goals, having a sense that we are trying to draw more and more folks into God's narrative, into this story and this experience that gives us life, leads us to the next salient question of where we are playing. What is the context and who are the people we are serving and seeking to transform? And this might seem incredibly obvious to us, but it looks like it plays out in a way that we tend to forget this. This is where we'll have the one-size-fits-all option, where we say what music and evangelism looks like, sounds like, means is this. But if we aren't sensitive to the space, the context where we at, then we're going to miss the mark. St. Augustine used to say that ministry is the art of arts, and what it requires is the right medicine for a particular ailment. So let's even look at the space here at St. Mary's. I'm standing on a platform stage behind an altar with an organ in the center of the sanctuary behind me. Does this look like it was built to be an Episcopal church as we tend to know it? No, what does it look like? And what's a little bit of the history of this place for someone who knows more about it than I do?
This church was donated to us. It was a gift. Should I say the church? It's
Yeah.
the Congregational Church. Our church was flooded in 2011 and we lost it. So for $1, they gave us this church and combined the two church together with Dover, Westover, and here.
Wow. What a blessing that is. I mean, God is good. Yeah. And so here we find ourselves in a church that was built with a different denominational sensibility, right? But because of that, we have a stage behind the altar here that invites a certain kind of musical participation, right? I wonder what it would be like in an old styled traditional Episcopal sanctuary with a high altar, without this sort of a platform, for Holly and Joe to do the kind of music ministry that they're able to do here. So location, context, really, really important when we think about how space wins, when we consider where it is that we're playing. But it's also equally as important that we think about who the folks are that make up our particular congregations. Some folks are not going to want to hear someone banging on a cajon to Latin rhythms, for as inviting as that's going to be to some of us. And our sense of having the wisdom to know the difference between what we accept in a certain culture and what we courageously attempt to change is part of that dynamic relationship, yeah? Okay, so how to serve is the next part of this sort of cascading approach to design thinking. What activities are needed and what is our offer? So this is where I think the rubber can hit the road with music and evangelism in the particular. Because we may find that we are in a community where there are folks who either aren't a part of our community yet, or who are underserved in our community in general, and recognize that we have an apostolic opportunity to adapt and tailor an approach to ministry for that specific group of people. Now, in my previous call, before I became rector of this church in Lancaster, I was the associate at a parish that just celebrated its 275th anniversary, historic St. James in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And again, keep in mind, I'm a guy coming from, the urban multicultural context of Miami, Fort Lauderdale. So in a lot of ways, I was a fish out of water. But one of the things that I thought was so amazing about this church, St. James, that I felt was a really healthy model was they have very fine, very well-supported, professionalized Anglo-Catholic liturgy. One of the finest Rite One services I've ever seen. I got to participate in week after week after week there. And they had a gargantuan choral 10 o'clock Rite Two with all the bells and whistles that we love. But here's what's equally as interesting. On Saturday nights, that same very historic parish realized that in order to meet people who weren't already in the church, they had to do something entirely different. So on Saturdays, they had contemporary music masses only that would feature specific recording artists and mirror what we would call tribute acts that they would advertise and would bring in fans of different artists and different genres to experience a simplified version of our common worship. So let's say you're walking down a popular street in a city and you see a sign that says, tonight we have a worship service featuring the music, let's say of the Beatles. Let's go something really popular that most of us have some exposure to. If you aren't tradition in the Episcopal ethos, if the music could seem potentially highbrow or even just foreign to one's context, that's the kind of opportunity to invite folks in that otherwise wouldn't be a part of what we're doing. And if we are thinking strategically about how we approach these sorts of things, we need not take away anything from folks who are tradition. Because sometimes we don't need to derail what's already working, but offer up complementary space that can be held for a population that isn't yet served by the sound of our church. And if we go further down that rabbit hole, because we're still all in the realm of ideas here, this is where it starts to get tough and where I think a lot of us mess up, because we're probably tracking so far. But we've got to think about what capacities we have and what capacities we need in order to be able to do this work. Musicians are very unique. I don't know that I've ever met two musicians who are entirely alike. I don't know that I've ever met two human beings that are entirely alike. I have a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. And if anything proves to me the existence of a soul, it's how different these two little dudes can be who have been given the same love, raised under the same household, and share the same DNA. And so our capacities in our congregations around the musicians we currently have should guide us by and large to where we begin this work. If we ask someone who is classically trained and does not know how to improvise to do what Dent has shown us to do, we are probably going to be dissatisfied with the result. The idea might not even translate. If we have folks who are new to the Episcopal ethos, who don't really know much about hymnody, who can't read music at all, who have come to a contemporary service that we then throw into a high Anglo-Catholic Mass setting without a bulletin, but flipping through the pages of the BCP and the 82 hymnal and a couple from Wonder, Love, and Praise in for good measure, maybe one from Lead Us, shuffling in the pews. We have made the barrier to entry so difficult for folks who might even want to be with us to seriously hedge the bet against their coming back again and again, let alone making our community their home. So really being sincere and sober about our capacities is at the heart of doing this work well. And as we move forward, we also have to make sure that we have the management systems in place to carry these things out. I hear more stories about musicians and innovative deacons or folks who serve on vestries that want to try new things that feel that they are just cut off at the knees because they lack clergy support. Or the clergy person who goes to evangelism conferences and wants to try something new, who goes home to a vestry with their arms folded and says, it's just not what we're about. So we have to have management systems in place that enable us to implement these sorts of things when we want to be innovative. And it's my hope that this integrated cascade of strategic choices will help us as a reference point when we are thinking about how we might change certain approaches to music in our congregations, so that we can, with some measure of serenity, know the difference between what we do have opportunities to change and what really is life-giving for folks the way that it is. So as we move forward, our attitude means a whole lot, friends. And there's a wonderful, wonderful sensibility that a guy named Will Willimon down at Duke had shared with me about the importance of learning how to strive satisfied without being complacent, while always looking to grow and learn, evolve and transform. We want to have a certain joy in approaching scenarios that always asks, how would my best self handle this situation? Particularly when we're passionate, particularly when our artistic feathers get ruffled. We can be so blinded by our sense of principle and commitment that we lose our center and we alienate people through our passion. And so we always want to seek clarity and reset, remembering who we are, whose we are, and seeing the human face of God written on those with whom we minister. We need to generate energy in what we do. Know how to transition folks from one mood or one feel into another. And helping people to see why it is that we're inviting certain kind of invitation, certain kind of change. We can't assume that people are going to get on the bus right away until we can sell them on our visions, until we can sell them on a new sound. We want to invite people to do work that feels meaningful. And at the end of it all, recognizing that if we want buy-in, we've got to offer people the chance to weigh in. Even when folks agree with what leadership has to offer, they seldom take it easy on leadership unless they feel like they were part of the decision-making process. People buy in when they weigh in. And so the collaborative necessity of making these kinds of shifts as we find our sound is absolutely imperative. And how we demonstrate courage, I think. And Jerusalem brought this up earlier around this, and this is particularly salient to we who make music in the church, is that we need to trust in the power to learn and gain future competency, to honor struggles as positive and keep a growth mindset. This brings us back to that Exodus narrative, where day after day, the people wondered if they would in fact starve. And yet day after day, that what is this stuff came down and nourished the people. Life never gets easier, but maybe we get stronger through the balance of being thankful and being humble, knowing that we do not know. And so as we look to strive satisfied and we bring joy in the music that we offer up, it's always important, I think, in closing here to remember that no matter how much passion we have for ideas, no matter how much talent any single person can bring into a context, that Ubuntu philosophy is so at the heart of our Christology, so at the heart of our ecclesiology. I am because we are. A person is a person through other persons. And so we find our sound together through compromise, through listening, and through sharing opportunities for one another to own the process and to hopefully find joy in the evolving results. And so with that, I'd like to invite any questions or wonderings around anything that I've shared that could be helpful to anybody. Yes, my friend. And would you please tell me your name and where you're from, because I can't see.
I'm Lincoln Rathman from St. Mary's here. I was wondering, you came to the church that where you're now rector. How did you implement this reconciling the traditional with the modern in your church?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. And this was where Lincoln, I really had to exercise a certain sensitivity and take my foot off the gas. When I had talked about finding people's adaptive capacities, one of the things that I recognized in my newer context, particularly with the pandemic going on, is that the music ministries were places that I didn't feel it was appropriate to mess with too much too quickly. So with our choir largely on hiatus because of COVID, we tried to just hold space with the current system that we had, and then find secondary opportunities to lend energy and support to people who wanted to make other kind of music. So here's a practicable solution. I had a group, and I still have a group at the parish where we're at together in Lancaster, that calls themselves a praise band. And this is a small group of spirited musicians who actually like evangelical songs of worship, the kind of stuff that we tend not to use in our liturgy. And a lot of times it's because of the theology. We'll notice that a lot of times when we hear contemporary Christian music, it's really about that atonement theology of the one and done, you're saved, and what we would call penal substitutionary atonement for any of the theology nerds in the audience, which can really turn off a lot of people in the Episcopal ethos who say, salvation is an ongoing thing. We're working this out day by day. And we don't tend to think sometimes that Jesus died because of something that Adam and Eve did bad in a primordial garden, right? We interpret scripture differently by and large in our context. So knowing those things, what we did is we created a digital platform for this group of musicians to express their art. And COVID was actually a perfect time. Given the crisis, what we did is brought out good video equipment and sound equipment, and we recorded a whole set of this group doing their stuff and really highlighted it in its finest form, and then posted it up on our website and advertised it through our newsletter and through our weekly communications so that folks could enjoy this music ministry outside of the context of our worship. We've also just started discerning another possibility for this. If some of this music isn't going to work right for us in a worship setting that is largely traditional, we've got a coffee hour in between our Rite 1 and our Rite 2 service. And we said to ourselves, why couldn't we, since we're trying to make this feel like a coffee house, have this praise group do this acoustic set during coffee hour where they're theologizing, where they're sharing, where they're evangelizing, but we're still able to keep our worship in a lane that feels right for the people who are coming to be fed with a particular understanding of what they need. So that's kind of, again, putting skin on the bone of that both and. So thank you, Lincoln, for that really helpful question. Well, I want to thank you so much for your generosity, for listening, and for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful weekend. But peace be with you, friends. Thank you for your time.